Abram and his family, they are heirs of the covenant promises of God. And the attitude of Abram and the attitude of Lot, it's actually revealing something deeper about them. And it's teaching us something about what it means to be a people who set our hope on the covenant promises of God.
Welcome to Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths. I'm Steve Hiller, and glad that you're with us as we continue our study of Abram. Today we're in Genesis 13 as we see Abram and his family being the recipients of God's blessing in their lives. You said a moment ago, as we look at the story, it's revealing something deeper about them and teaching us something about what it means to be a people of God. What did you mean by that?
Well, as the blessing grows in Abram's life and in his family, as God clearly strengthens his hand in his work and expands his reach and his influence and so on, we start to see the way in which Abram is receiving that and responding to it. And what we begin to see in Genesis 13 is really quite impressive. Abram appears to be holding to these things with an open hand and then using them generously. And there is something of a contrast that actually develops with his nephew Lot within this story, which is quite interesting. And we begin to feel something of a personal challenge, a challenge to respond, maybe not quite in the way that Lot is, and to respond with the open hand of faith as Abram does. I think it's very instructive. I think it's encouraging, and I think there's a challenge there too.
Well, we're going to look at that in our broadcast today, so if you can, grab your Bible and join us in the book of Genesis. We're in chapter 13 as we begin the open hand of faith. Here is Jonathan.
As the people of God travel through the different territories of the world to their promised homeland, as the people of God walk in faith, trusting in the promises of God day by day, there will be different types of tests along the way. There will be different ways in which faith will be tried and faith will be proved. That was true for Abram in his day, and of course it is true for us in our day. In Genesis chapter 12, the test that Abram faced immediately after receiving the covenant promises of God, the very first test he encountered was a test of material want, and it came in the form of a very severe famine. If you were with us last week, you will remember verse 10 of chapter 12, a famine strikes. Abram quickly leaves the land of promise under intense pressure. The animals are dying, the children are going hungry, and he heads down to Egypt. But on the way to Egypt, in the midst of this highly pressurized situation, he responds to the pressure by making a terrible choice, by committing a grievous sin. He decides to pretend that his attractive wife is just his sister so that no one will harm him in order to get to her. She is taken into Pharaoh's household as a wife of the king of Egypt. It's an awful saga. It's a tragic turn of events. It's a terrible blot on the story of the life of Abram. Pharaoh eventually discovers what has taken place, and he ejects Abram and his family from Egypt, and they end up then back in Canaan through the mechanism of deportation. It's a rather undignified way to go, but there it is. But now in chapter 13, as Abram journeys back up to the land of promise, it becomes clear that this physical journey is also a spiritual journey. There is clearly now a reset in the heart of Abram. Genesis makes it clear to us that Abram retraces his steps very precisely in order to get himself back to where he should be. It is a kind of geographical reset which mirrors the reset of the heart. Just notice it with me. Back in chapter 12 and verse 7, we find Abram in a good place, both geographically and spiritually. The Lord appears to him. He reaffirms his promise to him that he's going to give him the land. And Abram, as a sign of his commitment to the Lord and his reverence for the Lord, and as an act of claiming this land as the Lord's land, he builds an altar. From there, he goes to the hill country between Bethel and Ai, and he builds another altar, and he calls on the name of the Lord. Then, verse 9, he travels to the Negeb, and from there he makes the ill-fated journey down to Egypt. But now notice the return pilgrimage, both geographical and spiritual. Chapter 13 and verse 1. He goes up from Egypt to the Negeb. Verse 3, he journeys on as far as Bethel to the place where his tents had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. It is a complete retracing of his steps. Back to the land of promise, back to the altar he had made, and as we are going to see, back to a place of much greater spiritual health. And in all this, as we enter now into chapter 13, I think we just see so much of the grace of God. I just want to pause and notice that together before we get into the core issues of the chapter. Abram, he stumbled pretty badly in chapter 12. It's all a terrible mess. But the Lord doesn't allow him to stumble so greatly as to fall. The Lord isn't done with him, and he graciously picks him up, and he sets him back on the path of faith and obedience and discipleship once more. And I look at that. And I look at the opportunity that Abram is given to retrace his steps and to get back into the spiritual saddle. And I rejoice, actually. I rejoice in that because in all that, I think I see hope for myself. I see some hope because I think to myself, if God didn't give up on Abram after his big stumble, if God wasn't done with Abram after that debacle in Egypt, then surely this same God who has not changed one jot in all these years, surely this same God won't give up too easily on me or too easily on you when we stumble as we do. After we make a mess of things as we so easily can. After we are sinful and foolish as we so often are. And so chapter 13, it begins with an encouragement for the stumbling, the sinful, and the foolish. And perhaps just for some, that is precisely the encouragement we need today. Now, if the crisis of Genesis chapter 12 was a crisis of material need, the new crisis of Genesis chapter 13, the new test, arrives in the form of material prosperity. Notice what we're told right at the beginning of the narrative, verse 2. Now, Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. Abram started out with prosperity before ever he actually went to Canaan. But Pharaoh had now enriched him greatly in Egypt. We see that in chapter 12 and verse 16. And down in Egypt, Abram had progressed from being a rich person to being a very rich person. As we'll see in a moment, the challenges of abundance will define this chapter. What will Abram do when there is material plenty before him? What will he do when faced with this choice about how to handle, how to respond to the opportunities of wealth? It's a fascinating predicament. Perhaps it is a predicament you might feel you would be willing to sign up for and endure yourself. Hardly a bad problem to have, we might think. But what we're going to find is that this predicament takes us to the very heart of what it means to know the Lord, to wait upon the promises of God, to hope for the eternal inheritance that he sets before his people, and to teach us some vital lessons about these things. Genesis chapter 13 will set out before us a stark contrast between two men, Abram and his nephew Lot. The situation arises because of sheer abundance. Abram has brought his nephew Lot along with him on this pilgrimage, and both Abram and Lot have built up quite an entourage. We saw that in verse 2. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold, and so evidently was Lot, verse 5. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions, both of them, were so great that they could not dwell together. And then there was this strife between their herdsmen. This family has become so prosperous through the kindness of God that they can't all be supported by the land in one place. To make room for their abundance, they need to split from one another and settle in different regions. On one level, it's a nice problem to have. What follows now is a discussion and an agreement on who is going to go where, on which territory each one is going to claim. It would be easy for us reading that to imagine that this incident, this chapter in the Scriptures, is simply a story about a real estate deal or an inheritance negotiation or a bit of family politics. It would be easy for us to read Genesis 13 just on that kind of a level and to take some merely practical tips and lessons away from it. How do we make a deal when we need to make a deal? How do we split up an inheritance when we need to split up an inheritance? How do we avoid tension within a family when there's risk of that? And no doubt we could learn some good lessons, some valuable lessons about those things from this chapter. But we need to step back at this point and remember that in these events, in the life of this particular family, we are dealing with no ordinary inheritance. Abram and his family, they are heirs of the covenant promises of God. And the land of Canaan is at the heart of those promises, and it is the great symbol of the inheritance. And so the attitude of Abram and the attitude of Lot toward this land, it's actually revealing something deeper about them, about their response to the Lord, about their trust in the Lord. And it's teaching us something pretty fundamental about what it means to be a people who set our hope on the covenant promises of God.
You're listening to Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths, a message today called The Open Hand of Faith. And we have to pause right here, but we'll get back to this message from Genesis 13 in just a moment. Well, Encounter the Truth is a listener-supported broadcast. We're able to stay on the station because of your generosity, so thank you to those of you who are giving a gift of support. And as you give a gift of any amount this month, we want to say thank you by sending you a book that Jonathan has used with his own kids. It's called Everything a Child Should Know About God, written by Ken Taylor, and this book is our thank you gift to you as you give a financial gift of any amount in support Encounter the Truth this month. You can find out more or give online by coming to encounterthetruth.org or call us and give your gift over the phone. The toll-free number is 833-998-7884. That might be easier to remember as 833-99-TRUTH. Or again, come to the website, encounterthetruth.org. Well, if you have just joined us, we are in the book of Genesis. We're at chapter 13 today as we continue the message, The Open Hand of Faith. Here is Jonathan.
Let's look at each of them in turn. We begin with Lot and what I have called the tight fist of materialism. Abram sees the problem before him and he says, look, verse 8, let's not have a fight here over the family inheritance. We can't all have grandma's diamond ring. We can't all have dad's nice golf set. We can't all move into the old family home. We all can't squeeze into the old family cottage anymore. We can't all live in this part of the land. Let's go our separate ways. Let's just divide things up. And Abram, verse 9, he lets Lot choose. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, I will go to the right. Or if you want the right hand, I will go to the left. Now, it's very interesting that Abram does this because he might argue that the land has been promised to him and his offspring, and his nephew doesn't really count. But Abram, he's treating him as part of his own family, and he's being more than generous here. And Lot, well, for his part, he doesn't hesitate, does he, to take Abram up on the offer? There's no tussle of any kind here. I remember distinctly when I was a kid going to the Swiss Chalet one day for a meal with some of our extended family. It may have been a Sunday lunch after church. The Swiss Chalet was kind of the go-to restaurant for Sunday lunch in those days among Christians where we lived. Perhaps it was the same way here. In any event, the meal was over. And it was time for the bill. This was in the days when the bill came on a little plastic tray with a pen so you could sign the credit card impression. Anyway, I remember distinctly my father and my uncle both trying to grab this little tray at the same moment before the other one got to it. They both knew that they'd have to act fast if they were going to pay for lunch. And I distinctly remember as they both grabbed it, the plastic tray cracked in half. as the waitress looked on, and they both got hold of it at the same moment. I don't know who paid in the end. I don't know if they got billed extra for the broken plastic tray. But the incident was funny, and it was memorable in its own way. Well, there was no tussle over the offer to pay here in Canaan. Abram began with a gracious offer, and Lot was all too ready to take him up on it. Verse 10, and Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from one another. Lot lifts up his eyes, and there is a twinkle of joy and anticipation there. He's looking at possibilities. It's the look of someone leafing through the luxury real estate magazine over coffee and just imagining what might be. It's the look of someone flicking through Realtor.ca when they've set the price limit as unlimited and just noticing what's available. But as we follow Lot's twinkling but wandering gaze, we do detect some signs of trouble, don't we? We do hear some notes of warning, don't we? Lot sees the valley of the Jordan River. It's well watered, it's green. The herds, he knows they would flourish there. In fact, it's so lush, it's so beautiful, it's a little bit reminiscent of a place that is now closed off to the human race. It's reminiscent of a now forbidden place, the Garden of Eden itself. And Lot thinks to himself, this is like the garden. This is heaven on earth. In fact, Lot thinks to himself as he considers it more, you know what, this is actually, it's an awful lot like Egypt. That neighboring and ungodly land that was a refuge to the family not so long ago, fertile, lush, well-watered, but never a friendly or safe place for the people of God. The valley of the Jordan River would actually put Lot at the very edge of the land of promise, potentially even outside the land of promise. And we feel more and more, gradually more uneasy as we follow Lot's wandering eye. But then the really terrifying note comes in those brackets at the end of verse 10. You will have noticed it. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. As we know the story of what is to come, we know that this is a city that will be destroyed in a great act of judgment from God. It's a foreboding mention. It spells trouble to come. This is a godless place. The text makes it clear, doesn't it? Verse 13. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Nonetheless, this is where Lot is headed, verse 11. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. As we're seeing here in this chapter, in this section of Genesis, the geographical movements that take place end up being spiritually significant. They tell us something about the heart. It's true both for Abram and for Lot. We're told here that Lot headed east, and that in itself is actually significant in Genesis. When Adam and Eve sinned against the Lord and were expelled from the garden, it seems that they actually headed east themselves. Genesis 3 and verse 24, God drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed a cherubim and a flaming sword. When Cain killed his brother Abel in Genesis 4, we read in Genesis 4 and verse 16 that Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. It was a people who had been journeying in the east, we're told, who decided to build the Tower of Babel at the start of Genesis 11 and verse 2. To head east in the geography of Genesis, at least sometimes, means trouble. I don't want to offend folk here from Nova Scotia or PEI, or to flatter those from Alberta or BC. It's not that east is better than west in some objective sense, but here in the narrative of Genesis, it seems that east is where you go if you're heading away from the Lord. What's going on with Lot? What are we to make of this? Well, it's clear that Lot's main interest was not to be safely within the territory of Canaan, in the land of promise. He ventured to the very edge of the land, maybe outside the land, and his choice of territory was based on one thing and one thing only. He wanted to find paradise on earth. He wanted to find the most beautiful, the most fertile, the most productive land he could find. And on one level, we look at that and we listen to that and we think, well, that's fine. I mean, who wouldn't want that? That's probably what we would do if we were in Lot's shoes. But I think we're meant to see here, we're meant to see that Lot was working purely on the physical and the material plane. And because he was driven by physical and material considerations, the Lord and his promises, the Lord and his purposes, they weren't on his mind. And his uncle Abram and his needs, that wasn't on his mind either. In fact, Lot was going to take whatever he could get because the physical land and the wealth that could flow from it were clearly his number one priority. But you know what Lot didn't anticipate was where all this was going to take him. We're told in verse 12 that he moved his tent as far as Sodom. By the next chapter, chapter 14 and verse 12, we're going to learn that Lot is dwelling in Sodom. He's now living in the wicked city. And by chapter 19, when the angels come to warn Lot of the city's destruction, we find that he has well and truly made his home there. Reformer John Calvin writes of this account that, and I quote, Lot, when he fancied he was living in paradise, was nearly plunged into the depths of hell. You see, he thought he had chosen for himself a little piece of heaven. But the truth was that he had started a journey on the road leading to destruction. That's Lot with the closed fist of the materialist. He grabbed what he wanted from this world without regard for the Lord or his promises, without regard for his relative, his neighbor, and he held it tight. And in so doing, he set himself on a very dangerous path.
Well, next time, we are going to look at Abram and how he demonstrates that he has that open hand of faith. You're listening to Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths, and a message by that same title, The Open Hand of Faith, is today we've been looking at Genesis 13. And if you've missed any part of this broadcast, you can always come to our website and listen to what you missed. Just come to encounterthetruth.org, and you can stream the program through your computer or mobile device. You can also download an MP3 for free. Again, our website address is encounterthetruth.org. You know, Encounter the Truth is a listener-supported broadcast, and that's exactly what it sounds like. We're able to stay on this station as you give a gift and support this ministry. And if you give this month, we want to say thank you by sending you a book called Everything a Child Should Know About God. Jonathan, that's a bold statement. Everything a child should know about God is encompassed or wrapped up in this little book. And I know it's a book that you used with your kids. So what's the kind of stuff that, kids might be learning if they go through this book with mom or dad and grandma and grandpa?
Well, it's a delightful introduction to who God is according to the Bible. What is his character? What is his nature? And how can we know him and respond to him? And yeah, we found it to be a very valuable resource. I think parents who are wanting to figure out how to have some daily Bible study with their children, or grandparents who are wanting to feed into their grandkids' lives, will find this book to be a great resource that can be used again and again. We haven't just read it once, we've read it through multiple times, and it's simple enough that kids, as they learn to read themselves, it can be an early book that they read for themselves as well. So it serves that purpose nicely too, while giving good spiritual content.
Sounds like a great book for mom or dad to get, grandma and grandpa to get, but maybe even a book if you have somebody in your family, in your life, who is going to be having a baby or has little ones. Could be a great gift book. It looks like a beautiful hardcover book. Is that right?
It is. It's nicely produced. It's an older book by Kenneth Taylor, who was a well-known author in a previous generation, but it's been refreshed and re-illustrated and reissued in the last few years, and it's a really nice edition.
Well, we'd love to send you a copy as you give a gift and support Encounter the Truth this month. Give online at encounterthetruth.org or call us at 833-99-TRUTH. That's 833-998-7884, or again, the website encounterthetruth.org. Well, thanks for doing that and for listening today. I hope you'll join us next time.